Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, perhaps light a very subtle, unscented candle, and let our minds drift back to a time when art wasn't just something you scrolled past on a screen, but something you could reach out and almost touch. Well, almost. Imagine yourself in a dusty, dimly lit workshop, the air thick with the scent of plaster and anticipation. You're about to embark on a journey, not just through history, but through a process so intricate, so utterly demanding, that you'll probably conclude your modern-day patience levels won't survive the first 5 minutes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the precipice of a forgotten art, a meticulous dance between sculptor and copier, where the goal isn't to create something entirely new, but to recreate, with painstaking fidelity, the genius of another. Tonight, we're not just talking about making a simple copy, we're delving into the world of plaster casts, those ghostly white doppelgangers of marble gods and bronze heroes that once populated every serious art academy and discerning collector's drawing room. This isn't a quick print from a 3D scanner. Oh no, this is an art form born of patience, precision, and an almost obsessive devotion to detail. Imagine, for a moment, a world without high-resolution photographs or digital archives. If you lived in, say, 18th century London and wanted to study Michelangelo's David, you couldn't just pull up an image on your phone. You had two options: either undertake the arduous, often dangerous, and incredibly expensive grand tour to Florence, or you could study a plaster cast. For centuries, these casts were the bedrock of art education, allowing students across Europe to intimately engage with classical masterpieces without ever leaving their home city. It was a democratizing force, in a way, bringing the world's great sculptures to those who couldn't travel. Though, historians still argue whether the widespread dissemination of plaster casts truly democratized art access or, conversely, devalued the aura of the original masterpiece by making it ubiquitous. It's a debate that continues to echo through museum corridors today. The very concept of replication isn't new, of course. The ancient Romans, famously enamored with Greek art, were prolific copyists, often commissioning marble versions of lost Greek bronzes. But making a cast, a direct impression of the surface, takes the idea of copying to an entirely different level. It's not an interpretation, it's an attempt at perfect mimicry, a ghost of the original, captured in inert material. You're not just looking at a statue, you're looking at its skin, its very texture, every chisel mark and subtle contour faithfully transposed. This process, as you'll soon discover, is not for the faint of heart, nor for those who have a low tolerance for mess. One wrong move, and your pristine workspace will look like you've been hosting a very enthusiastic snow angel competition indoors. Your significant other might even start asking questions. Think about the sheer dedication involved. Before the advent of modern materials, the mold-making process was a trade secret, passed down through generations. Imagine a master craftsman, his hands calloused and stained, meticulously building up layers around a precious original. It wasn't just about pouring plaster, it was about understanding the sculpture's anatomy, predicting how the mold would separate, and anticipating every minuscule challenge. This was detective work, engineering, and artistry all rolled into one. It's the kind of project that makes watching paint dry feel like a high-octane thriller. In the 19th century, this practice reached its zenith with the creation of vast, cast courts, in major museums, like those still found at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. These were not just collections, they were veritable forests of white, where you could wander among full-scale plaster replicas of monumental works, entire Roman arches, towering Gothic portals, and classical sculptures, all under one roof. It was an immersive experience, a global art tour without the seasickness. For many, these casts were the originals, the closest they would ever come to experiencing these masterpieces firsthand. It was a wonderfully quirky tidbit of art history, this era where copies reigned supreme, sometimes even overshadowing the originals in their sheer accessibility and educational impact. The artistry involved in creating these replicas goes far beyond mere technical skill. You're not just making a physical copy, you're preserving a moment in time, a tangible link to the past. Each plaster cast, meticulously crafted, tells a story not only of the original sculpture but also of the hands that copied it, the intentions behind its creation, and the cultural landscape that valued its dissemination. It's an act of deep respect for the original, a quiet homage to the artist's initial vision. The process requires a unique blend of scientific understanding of material properties, chemical reactions, and structural integrity, combined with an artist's eye for form, texture, and nuance. You're essentially becoming a temporary custodian of a masterpiece, entrusted with the delicate task of capturing its essence without causing it any harm. This journey we're about to undertake together, exploring the painstaking steps of plaster casting, will reveal why these replicas are far more than just cheap imitations. They are, in themselves, works of art, born of a tradition that stretches back centuries. They stand as testaments to human ingenuity, to the enduring desire to share beauty, and to the painstaking effort required to bring a distant masterpiece within reach. You'll learn that every pore, every layer, every gentle separation is a calculated risk, a testament to the caster's nerve and skill. You might even find yourself developing a newfound appreciation for the humble plaster cast, often overlooked in favor of its more famous, more expensive, and far more difficult to transport marble or bronze counterpart. Believe me, you thought assembling IKEA furniture was a challenge? Try moving a full-size plaster cast of the Laocoon group without calling in a small army of professional movers and a chiropractor on standby. So settle deeper into your pillows. Let the soft hum of the fan, or perhaps the gentle crackle of a distant fire, lull you into a state of deep relaxation, because we're about to peel back the layers on a process that truly embodies the phrase slow and careful. We're not just talking about history, we're talking about the meticulous artistry that allowed the world to touch, to study, and to fall in love with sculptures, even if they were thousands of miles away. Alright, settle in, because while our last chat was all about the grand idea, the real adventure, the one that hums quietly in the background of a museum, truly begins with a choice. Not just any choice, mind you, but the very first, most crucial, and perhaps most nerve-wracking decision you'll ever make in this whole delicate dance of replication, selecting your sculptural subject. Imagine standing in a hushed gallery, the soft glow of the display lights caressing ancient marble, the faint scent of history clinging to the air, and you're not just admiring. Oh no. You're evaluating. You're scrutinizing. You're playing detective with a very specific, and rather weighty, checklist in your mind. The first thing your mind drifts to, almost unconsciously, is the sheer form of the sculpture. Is it a sleek, minimalist modern piece, all smooth lines and unblemished surfaces, looking like it just stepped out of a highly polished future? Or are you staring down a Baroque masterpiece, a riot of swirling drapery, outstretched limbs, and expressions so dramatic they practically leap off the plinth? This isn't just about aesthetic preference, it's about engineering. Every curve, every fold, every isolated finger or strand of windblown hair presents a unique challenge to your future mold. Think of it like trying to wrap a perfectly smooth, round ball versus trying to wrap a startled octopus. One is simpler. You find your eyes tracing the negative spaces, the voids, the areas where the sculpture recedes into itself. These are what we in the biz, if we were wearing little hard hats and clipboards, would call undercuts. An undercut is any part of the sculpture that overhangs, or dips in, creating a void that would trap a rigid mold. Picture a statue of a person with an arm bent at the elbow, the forearm resting against their chest. That little pocket of air between the arm and the torso? That's an undercut. Now, imagine 100 of those. Or 1,000, in the case of a sculpture depicting a swirling battle scene with dozens of figures intertwined. Each one of those undercuts is a tiny, silent scream of, "How on earth are you going to get a mold off me without breaking me or yourself?" It's a bit like trying to pull a tight sweater over a porcupine without snagging a single quill. Good luck with that. You're mentally mapping out potential mold sections, already calculating where you'd have to make cuts, envisioning seams that will later need to be meticulously hidden. It's a spatial puzzle of monumental proportions, and you haven't even touched the thing yet. Then, your assessment shifts to the sculpture's fragility. This is where your heart might do a tiny little flutter of anxiety, because now you're not just thinking about complexity, but about the very real possibility of accidental damage. What material are you dealing with? Is it the cool, smooth resilience of polished bronze, which, while heavy, tends to be quite robust? Or is it the delicate, sometimes crumbly, surface of ancient terracotta, perhaps a piece that has survived millennia only to be potentially jeopardized by your earnest intentions? Marble, while seemingly strong, can be surprisingly brittle, especially if it's old and has hairline cracks that aren't immediately visible to the naked eye. Imagine a whisper-thin finger, extending precariously from a hand, or a delicate laurel wreath with individual leaves barely thicker than a piece of paper. The mere thought of applying a mold material, even one designed to be gentle, sends a shiver down your spine. You're not just looking at the sculpture, you're looking through it, trying to gauge its structural integrity. Are there old repairs, perhaps discolored patches where previous breaks were mended? Are there areas of erosion, where centuries of exposure to air and touch have worn away the original surface detail? The surface itself holds a universe of information, and its details are paramount. Is the sculpture highly polished, reflecting light like liquid silk, or is it rough and textured, perhaps deliberately so, to mimic fabric or skin? Every minuscule groove, every tool mark left by the original artist, every subtle variation in texture needs to be captured. This is where the magic happens, where the replica transcends being just a copy and becomes a true echo of the original. You lean in, metaphorically of course, because touching is a big no-no unless you're a highly authorized conservator, trying to discern the individual strands of hair, the subtle undulations of muscle beneath stone, the delicate veins in a hand. Sometimes, if you're lucky, and the light hits just right, you might even spot an almost invisible signature or a tiny, hidden symbol left by an ancient artisan, a quirky little tidbit that reminds you of the human touch behind these masterpieces. It's like finding a sculptor's forgotten grocery list tucked into a fold of marble drapery, utterly charming, and something you absolutely, positively need to capture. This careful assessment also extends to the sculpture's historical context and its current state of preservation. Many of the sculptures we admire today, especially those from antiquity, have undergone significant restoration over the centuries. Historians still argue whether the widespread dissemination of plaster casts, while democratizing access to art, ultimately diminished the perceived value and aura of the original masterpieces, but there's no denying their role in education. For instance, the practice of creating plaster casts really took off during the Renaissance, but it was in the 18th and 19th centuries that it became a cornerstone of art education. Major art academies across Europe established cast courts, vast halls filled with plaster reproductions of classical sculptures, allowing students to study the forms of antiquity without traveling to Rome or Athens. These casts were often made from molds taken directly from the originals, making them invaluable records. So, you're not just looking at a pretty object, you're looking at a historical document. Is there a delicate patina, a natural layer formed over centuries, that gives the sculpture its unique character? This isn't just dirt, it's a valuable, often irreplaceable, part of its history. You can't just scrub it off. You also consider the logistics. Can you even get to the sculpture? Is it perched precariously on a high pedestal? Is it behind a protective barrier? Is it even accessible for the extensive setup that will be required? And perhaps most importantly, do you have the permission? Because let's be real, you can't just waltz into the Louvre with a bucket of plaster and a dream. You'd need a small army of conservators, art historians, and probably a permit from the ghost of Michelangelo himself, all to ensure that not a single speck of dust falls out of place. This initial selection process, then, isn't a quick glance and a nod. It's a deep dive, a meticulous examination that requires patience, a keen eye, and a profound respect for the artwork. You're weighing the artistic merit against the technical feasibility, the historical significance against the inherent risks. It's a silent conversation you have with the sculpture itself, asking, "Are you ready for this journey?" And am I truly capable of doing you justice? Only when you feel that quiet, confident hum of affirmation do you even begin to consider the next, equally vital step. You've chosen your subject, perhaps a brooding Rodin or a serene classical bust, its form now etched into your mind's eye. You've weighed its historical significance against its physical fragility, its artistic merit against the practicalities of replication. But now, the intellectual assessment gives way to a profound, hands-on intimacy. This isn't just about making a copy, it's about a deep, almost meditative communion with the original, a silent promise to preserve its very essence. You stand before it, not just as an artist, but as a conservator, a custodian of its delicate beauty. The goal? To ensure that when your mold material finally touches its surface, it captures every single whisper of detail, every nuance, without causing the slightest harm. This means, my friend, that your patience, already a well-worn virtue by now, is about to be stretched to its absolute limit. Your first task, deceptively simple in its description, is to address the ubiquitous enemy of all art, dust. Oh, the dust! It settles like a fine, pervasive blanket over centuries, clinging to every curve and crevice, obscuring the subtle textures that make a sculpture truly come alive. You don't just grab a feather duster, though. Oh no. This isn't your weekend chore list, where a quick flick and a sneeze suffice. You approach with the hushed reverence of a surgeon, armed with an array of the softest brushes known to humanity: camel hair, sable, even specialized synthetic fibers designed not to abrade. You might even employ a gentle, controlled stream of filtered air, delivered through a specialized nozzle, not unlike the sort used to clean delicate electronics. The air whooshes softly, coaxing the tiny motes of history from their resting places, a ballet of invisible particles. Imagine the sheer concentration required, the slow, deliberate sweep of your hand, ensuring you don't scratch or mar the surface. It's like giving a very, very old, very expensive pet a bath, but without the possibility of it shaking water all over your pristine studio. Once the superficial dust is gone, you confront the deeper layers: environmental grime, accumulated oils from countless curious hands, or, in older times, candle soot, even pigeon droppings if it was outdoors for a spell, delightful, and perhaps even remnants of previous, less careful cleaning attempts. This is where the detective work truly begins. You'll use tiny cotton swabs, barely moistened with distilled water, or perhaps a carefully selected, extremely mild solvent, chosen specifically for the sculpture's material. Each stroke is microscopic, a gentle caress rather than a scrub. You're not trying to strip away its history, merely to reveal its original brilliance beneath the layers of time. The faint, almost imperceptible scent of ancient dust, mingled with the sterile tang of the solvent, might fill the air, a sensory link to the past, a whisper from the hands that first shaped it. Crucially, you must distinguish between dirt and patina. Patina, that beautiful, often iridescent film that forms naturally over time, is not grime. It's the very soul of the sculpture, a natural result of age and environmental interaction. On bronzes, it's the rich greens and browns. On marble, a subtle warmth or slight discoloration that speaks of countless decades. You are never to remove this. It's like scrubbing the character lines off a wise old face, erasing the very story it tells. Removing it would not only diminish its aesthetic value but also its historical authenticity. So your cleaning is a dance of discernment, a constant internal dialogue. Is this grime, or is this glorious age? Historians still argue whether certain aggressive cleaning practices of the past, though well-intentioned, inadvertently stripped away valuable historical information embedded in these surface layers, forever altering the original intent. As you clean, you're also meticulously inspecting every square millimeter. Are there hairline cracks, invisible to the casual observer but ready to betray you under the slightest pressure? Is a delicate finger already fractured and tenuously held? Has a previous, perhaps less than expert, restoration left a weak point, a visible seam that could fail? These are critical observations. Sometimes, a conservator must step in before you even think about applying mold material. They might consolidate a crumbling section with an invisible adhesive, gently reattach a loose fragment, or apply a temporary support to a fragile protrusion. The last thing you want is for the pressure of the mold material, however slight, to cause a catastrophic break. Imagine the horror! One wrong move, and you've just redesigned history in the most unfortunate way, turning a classical masterpiece into a modern abstract. Now, let's talk about porosity. Many sculptures, especially those made of unsealed marble, terracotta, plaster, or even wood, are inherently porous. If you were to apply your mold material directly to such a surface, it would simply soak in, bond, and become an inseparable part of the original. That would be less a casting and more a very expensive, very permanent hug. To prevent this, you apply a barrier layer, a sealant. This could be a very thin, almost invisible coat of shellac, a specialized synthetic resin, or even a particular type of wax. It's applied with the utmost care, often in multiple thin layers, allowing each to dry completely. The aim is to create a non-absorbent, smooth surface without altering the sculpture's original texture or details. It's a delicate balance, like applying the sheerest coat of nail polish to a priceless antique, ensuring it protects without obscuring. For centuries, artists and artisans have grappled with this very challenge. In the grand academies of Europe, like the French Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture, plaster casts were absolutely central to artistic training. Students would spend years drawing and modeling from these casts, learning anatomy, drapery, and composition without the expense or fragility of working directly with original masterpieces. This meant that the preparation and casting techniques had to be incredibly robust and repeatable. Early methods for preparing originals were often less refined, sometimes involving layers of animal fats or various oils, which could, over long periods, degrade the original surface or become rancid. It was a learning process, often by trial and error, sometimes with unfortunate consequences for the original, a testament to the evolving science of conservation. Speaking of quirky tidbits from history, did you know that some historical methods for mold release involved applying a mixture of soap and milk? Imagine the smell lingering in the studio. Or sometimes, even a fine dusting of talc, meticulously brushed into every crevice. While charmingly old school, these methods lack the precision and consistency of modern materials. Today, you're more likely to use sophisticated synthetic polymers designed specifically for this purpose. These release agents are engineered to create an incredibly thin, non-stick barrier that won't react with either the sculpture or the mold material, ensuring a clean separation every time. This brings us to the final, critical step in preparing the surface: the application of the release agent. Think of it as the ultimate non-stick coating for your priceless pan. This isn't a sealant, it's a lubricant, a microscopic slip-and-slide for your mold material. It might be a specialized wax, a silicone-based spray, or a soap solution, often applied with a soft brush or a fine misting spray. You ensure every single crack, every undercut, every tiny dimple is coated. If even a pinprick is missed, your mold material could bond there. And then you've got a very sticky, very expensive problem on your hands when it comes time for separation. Your patience will be tested, perhaps even more than waiting for your favorite streaming service to buffer when you're just about to find out who won the baking competition. Each application is a quiet prayer for perfect release. Once the release agent is meticulously applied and has set, if it needs to, you perform one last, exhaustive inspection. You might use a bright light, shining it from different angles to catch any missed spots, any areas where the coating might be uneven. You run your gloved fingertips lightly over the surface, feeling for any tackiness or resistance. The surface should feel smooth, almost slick, but without any visible residue. It's a moment of quiet triumph when you finally step back, knowing you've done everything humanly possible to protect this masterpiece and prepare it for its temporary embrace with the mold. The stage is now perfectly set for the next, equally delicate phase, the very first impression. Now, as the gentle hum of the cleaning brushes fades, and the precious original sculpture stands ready, you arrive at a crossroads as crucial as any in this painstaking journey: the choice of your mold material. This isn't just picking a paint color, it's selecting the very skin that will embrace the masterpiece, the ephemeral membrane that will capture every whisper of its surface. You see, The material you choose here isn't merely a vessel, it's a silent collaborator, a temporary twin to the sculpture itself, and its properties will dictate the success, or indeed the spectacular failure, of your entire endeavor. Understanding the nuanced dance between different mold materials, from the ancient, wobbly charm of gelatin to the modern, sleek embrace of silicone, is absolutely essential for a successful reproduction. Imagine, if you will, standing before a magnificent marble Venus, her delicate drapery frozen in stone, her fingers almost impossibly slender. Do you reach for something soft and pliable, or something rigid and unyielding? The decision hinges on a deep understanding of each material's strengths, weaknesses, and its peculiar personality. Let's begin our exploration with a material that, for centuries, held court in the world of casting: gelatin. Yes, gelatin, the very same stuff that gives your wobbly dessert its charming jiggle, albeit a far more robust, industrial grade. For a significant period, particularly throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, gelatin was the go-to material for replicating sculptures, especially those with intricate details or deep undercuts. It was celebrated for its extraordinary ability to capture the finest nuances of a surface, almost like a second skin. When warmed, it becomes a viscous, flowing liquid that can be poured or brushed onto the sculpture, seeping into every tiny pore and crevice. As it cools, it sets into a firm, yet remarkably flexible, jelly-like solid. This flexibility was its superpower, allowing it to be gently peeled away from complex forms without damaging the original, or tearing the mold itself. The sensory experience of working with warm gelatin is quite unique. A faint, savory scent, perhaps reminiscent of a very mild beef broth, permeates the air, and the material itself feels surprisingly substantial, yet yielding, beneath your gloved fingers. However, gelatin, for all its historical significance and detail-capturing prowess, was a high-maintenance diva. Its greatest strength was also its greatest vulnerability. Being water-based, it was incredibly sensitive to temperature and humidity. Too warm, and your meticulously formed mold could begin to sag and melt, like a forgotten Jell-O salad on a summer picnic table. Too cold, and it would become brittle, prone to cracking. And moisture? Oh, moisture was its nemesis. It would swell in high humidity and shrink as it dried, potentially distorting the precise dimensions of your replica. Furthermore, gelatin molds were perishable. They were organic, prone to attracting mold, bacteria, and even the occasional hungry insect if not properly stored and treated. Imagine the horror of discovering your perfect mold had become a buffet for microscopic creatures overnight. This meant that the window for casting was often quite narrow, requiring swift action once the mold was complete. You couldn't just stash a gelatin mold in a dusty corner for years and expect it to be ready when you were. It was a fleeting beauty, a temporary embrace. Moving beyond the culinary-adjacent world of gelatin, we encounter the more robust, though less flexible, world of plaster as a mold material itself. While plaster is primarily known as the material for the cast, which we'll get to later, it was also used to create molds, particularly for simpler, less undercut sculptures. Think of a very basic bust, or a flat relief. Here, plaster could be applied directly, often in sections, creating a rigid, multi-part mold. Its advantage lay in its low cost and relative ease of use. However, its rigidity meant that for anything but the simplest forms, the mold had to be made in numerous pieces, carefully keyed together, which added immense complexity to the demolding process. And unlike gelatin, a plaster mold offered no flexibility whatsoever. Once set, it was unyielding, meaning it could not navigate the subtle curves and deep recesses that a flexible mold could. It was also abrasive, meaning the original sculpture had to be very robust and well protected. Then came the advent of rubber, natural latex, to be precise. Picture a milky white liquid derived from the sap of rubber trees that you could paint onto the sculpture in thin, successive layers. Each layer would dry, gradually building up a tough, flexible skin. This was a significant leap forward, offering much greater durability and longevity than gelatin. The process was slow, mind you. Each layer needed to dry completely before the next could be applied, turning the creation of a rubber mold into a multi-day, sometimes multi-week, affair. The smell, too, was distinct, that unmistakable, slightly acrid scent of raw rubber, which could linger in the air for days, perhaps even whispering tales of old tires. While natural latex molds were more resilient, they still had their quirks. They could shrink slightly over time, especially if exposed to UV light, and some people experienced allergic reactions to the latex itself. As the 20th century progressed, chemists gifted the art world with a new generation of synthetic rubbers, specifically polysulfides and polyurethanes. These were two-part systems, meaning you mixed a base material with a catalyst, initiating a chemical reaction that would cause the mixture to cure and solidify. They offered improved tear strength, greater dimensional stability, and better resistance to environmental factors than natural latex. They were still applied in layers, building up thickness, and required careful, precise mixing of the two components. Get the ratio wrong, and your mold might never fully cure, remaining a sticky, unusable mess. These materials represented a significant step towards the modern era of mold making, offering a blend of flexibility and durability that was previously unattainable. But then, like a superhero arriving to save the day, silicone burst onto the scene. Silicone rubber, in its various forms, quickly became the undisputed champion of mold making for fine art replication. And for good reason. Imagine a material that flows like thick honey, yet cures into an incredibly soft, pliant, and unbelievably strong membrane. Silicone captures detail with an almost obsessive fidelity. Every fingerprint, every tool mark, every subtle texture on the original sculpture is replicated with astonishing precision. It is chemically inert, meaning it won't react with or damage even the most delicate or porous surfaces of your precious masterpiece. Unlike gelatin, it's virtually impervious to temperature fluctuations, within reason, of course. You're not going to bake it, and humidity. Unlike natural rubber, it doesn't shrink significantly over time and is highly resistant to tearing. Working with silicone often involves a two-part system, much like the synthetic rubbers, but its properties are superior. You mix the base with the catalyst, and it begins to cure, transforming from a liquid to a solid. For particularly intricate molds, or to ensure absolutely no tiny air bubbles are trapped against the sculpture's surface, which would show up as imperfections on your cast, you might even put the mixed silicone in a vacuum chamber to degas it, watching mesmerized as the bubbles rise and pop. The cured silicone feels smooth, almost velvety, and has an incredible elasticity, allowing it to stretch and bend around complex undercuts with ease, then spring back to its original shape. This flexibility is what allows for the creation of one-piece molds even for sculptures with significant protrusions, minimizing the need for complex, multi-part molds and reducing the risk of seam lines on the final cast. The major drawback of silicone? Its cost. It is, by far, the most expensive of the commonly used mold materials, which can make large-scale projects quite prohibitive if budget is a primary concern. You might find yourself doing mental arithmetic, calculating the cost of silicone per cubic inch, and wondering if your replica is worth its weight in liquid gold. However, its longevity and the sheer quality of the casts it produces often justify the investment, especially when you need to make multiple copies from a single mold. So, when you stand before that sculpture, contemplating your next move, you engage in a silent dialogue with the artwork itself. Is it a robust bronze, capable of withstanding the slight pull of a natural rubber, or a fragile plaster, demanding the gentle caress of silicone? Does it boast delicate, lace-like details that only gelatin or the highest-grade silicone could possibly capture? Is the budget tight, perhaps pushing you towards a more labor-intensive but cheaper solution, or is the goal absolute perfection, cost no object? The choice is a complex interplay of the sculpture's form, its material, its fragility, the desired fidelity of the replica, the number of casts required, and the resources at your disposal. Historians still argue whether the choice of mold material in the 19th century, particularly the prevalence of gelatin, subtly influenced the perceived perfection of some early plaster casts, or if minor distortions were simply accepted as part of the replication process. Regardless, your selection here is paramount, laying the foundational skin for the entire casting process to come. Now, with your chosen masterpiece carefully assessed and prepped, you stand at a crucial crossroads. You've admired its curves, its angles, its delicate undercuts. But how, you might wonder, do you actually get a mold off something that isn't just a simple, unadorned sphere? You can't exactly peel a three-dimensional sculpture off a one-piece mold like a sticker from a fruit, can you? Oh, if only it were that easy. Imagine trying to pull a sweater off a multi-limbed octopus. That's pretty much the challenge you're facing here. And no, the octopus doesn't appreciate the comparison, but you get the drift. This is where the true strategic brilliance of mold sectioning comes into play. You see, for anything beyond the most rudimentary, uncomplicated forms, think a perfectly smooth, solid egg or a child's building block, a single-piece mold is simply impossible. The moment a sculpture has an arm outstretched, a fold of drapery, a lock of hair curling back on itself, or any feature that creates an undercut, a part that tucks back in on itself, preventing a straight pull, you are immediately in multi-part mold territory. It's like trying to get a fitted sheet onto a king-sized mattress by yourself in the dark. You need multiple points of attack, and a lot of planning, unless you want to end up in a tangled mess. So, before any mold material even touches the hallowed surface of your chosen sculpture, you engage in an intense, almost meditative, session of spatial reasoning. This isn't just about cutting, it's about seeing. You walk around the sculpture, perhaps with a cup of lukewarm chamomile tea, your gaze tracing imaginary lines across its form. You're not just looking at the sculpture anymore, you're looking through it, mentally dissecting it into manageable, pullable pieces. Each section of the mold must be able to lift away from the original without snagging on any of its intricate details. This mental exercise is often called finding the draw. You're looking for the path of least resistance, the cleanest line of separation. Think of it like a topographical map, but instead of elevation lines, you're drawing potential parting lines. These are the future seams of your mold, the places where one section will meet another. You want these seams to be as inconspicuous as possible on your final cast, ideally running along existing lines within the sculpture, the edge of a cloak, the natural division between a limb and a torso, or even tucked away in the shadows of a deep fold. It's a delicate dance between engineering necessity and aesthetic sensibility. You wouldn't want a prominent seam running straight across the nose of a classical bust, would you? That would be like putting a giant, "Kick me" sign on a priceless work of art. Once you've mentally mapped out these parting lines, you might physically mark them on the sculpture itself, though with extreme care and using only materials that are easily removable and harmless. Sometimes, a thin thread or string is carefully laid along the proposed line, secured with tiny dabs of nonstick clay. Other times, a soft, erasable pencil might be used, or even just a keen eye remembering the precise path. This is the blueprint for your mold, and any miscalculation here could lead to a mold that simply won't release, potentially damaging your precious original. Historians still argue whether some ancient mold makers, particularly those crafting bronze statues using lost wax methods that involved incredibly complex piece molds, meticulously drew these lines, or if it was an intuitive skill passed down through generations. The sheer precision of some surviving ancient casts suggests a remarkable understanding of this draw principle. Beyond merely planning where the mold sections will separate, you also need to devise a system to ensure these sections fit back together perfectly, every single time. These are called keys or registration marks. Without them, your multi-part mold would be like a jigsaw puzzle with no interlocking pieces, just a pile of flat shapes that slide around haphazardly. Your final cast would be skewed, misaligned, and frankly, a bit wonky. And nobody wants a wonky replica of the Venus de Milo, unless it's for a very specific, postmodern art installation, perhaps. Keys can take many forms, from simple hemispherical bumps on one mold section that fit into corresponding depressions on an adjacent section, to more elaborate interlocking zigzags or even uniquely shaped lugs and slots. The goal is absolute precision. When you press the mold pieces together, they should snap into place with satisfying certainty, leaving no room for movement or misalignment. Imagine trying to build a Lego castle where the studs don't quite line up. Frustration, wonky walls, and ultimately collapse. Your keys are the Lego studs of the mold-making world. You create these keys by building up small dams of clay or wax along the parting lines, shaping them into the desired interlocking forms before the mold material is applied. As the first half of the mold cures, these clay dams create negative impressions in its edge. When you then remove the clay and apply the second half of the mold, the new material flows into these negative spaces, creating the complementary positive keys. It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, but it works flawlessly. The number and placement of keys are crucial. Too few, and the mold might shift. Too many, and you're just adding unnecessary complexity to the demolding and reassembly process. It's like designing a fancy lock, intricate enough to work, simple enough not to frustrate. The material of your inner mold also influences your sectioning strategy. If you're using a very flexible material like silicone, you might be able to get away with fewer sections, as the silicone can stretch and flex around slight undercuts. However, even silicone has its limits. Trying to pull it off a truly aggressive undercut will still damage the mold or the original. For less flexible materials, like traditional plaster piece molds, which were the standard for centuries before modern elastomers, the sectioning has to be even more precise and numerous. Think of the complex plaster molds made for the reproduction of classical Greek and Roman sculptures during the Renaissance. These molds often comprise dozens, if not hundreds, of individual pieces, each meticulously numbered and keyed. It was an industry unto itself, and a highly skilled one at that. A quirky tidbit: some historical mold makers, especially those working with extremely delicate or valuable originals, would sometimes build up a thin layer of wax over the sculpture first, then cut that wax layer into sections, and build the mold on top of the wax. This provided an extra layer of protection for the original and allowed for more precise, risk-free planning of the cuts. It's like building a temporary, sacrificial skin to practice on. Talk about taking meticulousness to another level. The complexity of your sectioning directly correlates with the complexity of the sculpture. A simple portrait bust might require just 2 or 3 sections, a front, a back, and perhaps a small top piece for the crown of the head. But imagine a sculpture like the Laocoon group, with its intertwining figures, serpentine coils, and deeply carved drapery. That's not just a multi-part mold, it's a multi-part mold, possibly requiring hundreds of individual pieces, each carefully planned and keyed. Each arm, each leg, each snake, each fold of cloth would need its own precise draw and its own set of keys. It's like designing a highly advanced 3D puzzle where every piece has to be perfect, and you're the one cutting the pieces. This planning phase, while seemingly passive, is arguably the most intellectually demanding part of the entire process. It requires foresight, an understanding of physics, and an almost intuitive grasp of three-dimensional space. You're not just making a copy, you're reverse engineering the very form of the sculpture itself, figuring out how it can be born anew from its negative space. It's a quiet, intense period of contemplation, where the only sounds might be the gentle hum of the studio's ventilation and the soft whisper of your own thoughts as you mentally peel away layer after layer of the sculpture's form. It's also where you might occasionally mutter to yourself, "Whose idea was it to cast this thing with that many undercuts?" A common, albeit silent, lament among mold makers. But then, you take another sip of that lukewarm chamomile, adjust your gaze, and dive back into the intricate puzzle. Now, with your chosen mold material, let's imagine, for this delicate first impression, you've opted for a high-grade, artist-quality silicone, perhaps a 2-part platinum cure variety known for its incredible fidelity. You embark on the most critical phase of the entire casting process. This isn't just about slathering something on, it's about a tender, almost reverent application, like an art conservator performing microsurgery on a priceless artifact. Because, let's be honest, that's essentially what you're doing, albeit with a slightly less terrifying outcome if you mess up. Though, trust me, the internal scream is still pretty loud. You've mixed your silicone components with the meticulous precision of a mad scientist brewing a love potion, part A and part B, usually in equal measure, stirred gently but thoroughly to avoid introducing excess air bubbles. This is where the magic, and the science truly begin. You notice the subtle chemical scent, perhaps a faint vinegary tang, as the two liquids combine and begin their slow transformation. It's not unpleasant, more like the smell of a very clean, very serious workshop. With a soft, natural bristle brush, perhaps a sable or badger hair, you approach the sculpture. This isn't your average paint-by-numbers brush. This is the Ferrari of brushes, designed to glide and caress. You dip the brush into the freshly mixed, still liquid silicone, taking just a small, manageable amount. The first touch to the sculpture is the moment of truth. You apply the silicone with an almost feather-light touch, allowing the material to flow naturally into the sculpture's contours. Think of it less as painting and more as an extremely careful, viscous caress. You're not trying to push the material around aggressively, you're guiding it, encouraging it to settle into every single, microscopic crevice. The goal here is a thin, even layer that captures every detail, no matter how minute. We're talking about the sculptor's fingerprint in the clay, the subtle texture of drapery, the faint lines of an aging face. This layer is the memory foam of the mold world, designed to remember everything. You begin by stippling, gently dabbing the brush, working the silicone into every undercut, every wrinkle, every pore. The idea is to push out any trapped air, which is the mortal enemy of a perfect cast. An air bubble, no matter how tiny, will create a corresponding bump on your final replica, like a miniature, unwanted zit on the face of a classical god. And nobody wants that. You might find yourself humming softly, or holding your breath, as you meticulously work your way across the surface. Your focus narrows until the world outside the sculpture, and your brush simply ceases to exist. It's a meditative state, a dance between liquid and solid, between your intent and the material's properties. You're watching the silicone as it spreads, self-leveling in some areas, needing a gentle coaxing in others. For particularly intricate sections, like a cascade of curls on a Roman bust or the delicate folds of a garment, you might even use a finer brush, or a small, pointed tool, to gently tease the silicone into every last nook and cranny. It's like trying to get toothpaste into every single groove of a tiny, intricate seashell. Precision is paramount. Historically, this initial impression layer was often the most perilous. Before the advent of modern silicones, sculptors and mold makers relied on materials like gelatin, or even plaster itself for direct impressions. Imagine trying to capture the subtle nuances of a marble statue with warm, gooey gelatin. It was a common practice in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially during the Grand Tour, where wealthy Europeans would commission copies of classical masterpieces. These early gelatin molds, often reinforced with plaster, were incredibly fragile and had a very limited lifespan, sometimes only good for a single cast before they began to degrade. They were also highly susceptible to temperature and humidity, making their use a race against time and the elements. One quirky tidbit from the annals of mold-making history involves the use of bread dough. Yes, humble bread dough, sometimes mixed with wax or oil, was occasionally employed for very small, extremely delicate impressions, particularly for intaglios or cameos. The dough would be pressed into the detail, allowed to dry and harden slightly, and then carefully removed. While certainly not suitable for a life-sized Venus de Milo, it speaks to the ingenuity of early artisans who had to make do with what was readily available. Imagine explaining that to your modern-day art school professor. Yes, I've brought my mold, it's a bit stale, but it gets the job done. As you continue applying the silicone, you pay close attention to the thickness. This first layer needs to be thin enough to capture the detail without obscuring it, yet thick enough to have some integrity. Too thin, and it might tear when you eventually remove the mold. Too thick, and it could lose some of that exquisite detail, or worse, introduce its own distortions. You're aiming for something akin to a perfectly applied layer of cling film, but one that magically solidifies and retains its shape. You work methodically, section by section, ensuring complete coverage. No bare patches are allowed. This isn't a painting where you can come back later and touch up a spot. If you miss a detail now, it's gone forever in this particular mold. You might gently tap the sculpture or the table it rests on to encourage any stubborn air bubbles to rise to the surface. Sometimes, you'll see tiny pinpricks of air appear, which you can then carefully pop with the tip of a fine needle or a wisp of air from a small, controlled puff. It's like playing whack-a-mole with microscopic imperfections, and you, my friend, are the champion. The initial curing time for this first layer is crucial. For silicone, it might be anywhere from an hour to several hours, depending on the specific product and environmental conditions. During this period, the material transitions from a liquid to a flexible, rubbery solid. You're not just waiting, you're observing. You're looking for any signs of shrinkage, any missed spots, any areas where the silicone might not have fully conformed. This is the quiet vigil, where you mentally review every brushstroke, every dab, every careful movement. It's a moment of profound patience, something that our fast-paced digital world often forgets the value of. There are no instant downloads here, just a slow, deliberate march of chemistry. This careful application of the first impression layer is a direct link to the preservation of art history. Think of how many famous sculptures we know today only through plaster casts, because the originals were lost or destroyed. The Parthenon marbles, for example, have a complex history of casting, with copies made as early as the 18th century. These casts, sometimes referred to as squeezes, allowed scholars and artists across Europe to study the masterpieces without needing to travel to Athens. In fact, many art academies throughout history maintained extensive collections of plaster casts, not just as study aids but as a fundamental part of artistic education. Students would spend countless hours drawing from these casts, learning anatomy, proportion, and the nuances of light and shadow on three-dimensional forms. Historians still argue whether the widespread availability of these casts, while democratizing access to classical forms, might have inadvertently diluted the unique aura of the original masterpieces. It's a fascinating debate about authenticity versus accessibility. As the silicone slowly firms up, you can almost feel the sculpture's essence being transferred. It's not just a physical impression, it feels like a memory being recorded, a moment in time captured. The surface of the silicone, once wet and shiny, becomes matte and pliable. You might gently touch a small, inconspicuous area to test its tackiness, confirming that it's beginning to set. This isn't a race, remember. Rushing this step would be like trying to bake a cake in 5 minutes. You'd end up with a messy, unformed disaster. The beauty of this first layer is its direct intimacy with the original. It's the closest the copy will ever come to the source, the direct tactile memory of the sculpture's surface. Every subsequent layer, every support structure, every step that follows, builds upon the fidelity established in this crucial moment. Without this perfect first impression, everything else is just an approximation, a shadow of what could have been. So you linger, you observe, you ensure that every curve, every plane, every whisper of the artist's hand has been lovingly and accurately embraced by this delicate, nascent skin of silicone. Now, with that delicate first impression layer gently clinging to the sculpture's every curve and crevice, you stand at a crucial juncture. It's like the first whisper of a secret, incredibly fragile, and easily lost if not immediately protected. This initial coat, remember, is all about capturing that pristine detail, that microscopic texture. But it's far too thin to hold its shape, to withstand the rigors of future handling, or to resist the subtle, insidious forces of gravity and time that would twist it into an unrecognizable blob. Imagine trying to build a house with just a single coat of paint. It simply wouldn't stand. So you embark on the painstaking process of building strength layers. This isn't about adding more detail, that job is done. This is about structural integrity, about creating a resilient shell that will faithfully preserve the initial impression. Think of it as constructing the muscular armature beneath the skin, giving the mold its backbone, and preventing any dreaded distortion. You need to transform that flimsy film into a robust, self-supporting structure. The material you use for these subsequent layers might be the same as your first, perhaps silicone or gelatin, but its consistency will likely be different. Where the first layer was often thin to flow into every minute detail, subsequent layers are typically made thicker, more viscous. You're not looking for liquid silk anymore. You're looking for something with a bit more body, something that can build up volume without dripping away. It's a bit like the difference between painting a watercolor wash and applying thick impasto oil paint. Both are paint, but their application and purpose are distinct. You might even adjust the ratio of catalyst to base, if you're using a two-part material like silicone, to slightly alter the curing time, giving you more working time for these larger applications. You begin to apply the next layer, often with a wider, softer brush or even your gloved hands, gently dabbing and spreading the thicker material over the still tacky first coat. The key here is adherence. You don't want any air bubbles trapped between layers, creating voids that could compromise the mold's strength or even cause it to delaminate later. It's a rhythmic, almost meditative process. Dab, spread, smooth, repeat. You work methodically, ensuring even coverage, building up thickness little by little. You're not trying to create a single, monolithic slab. Rather, you're constructing a series of carefully bonded strata, each contributing to the overall strength. As you build, you might start to incorporate reinforcement materials. This is where the mold truly starts to gain its muscle. For centuries, mold makers have relied on various fibrous materials to add tensile strength to their molds. Historically, coarse linen, burlap, or even specially prepared cheesecloth were common choices. You might cut strips of this fabric and embed them within the still wet mold material, pressing them gently into place to ensure they are fully saturated and bonded. It's like adding rebar to concrete, but far more delicate. These fibers act as a kind of internal scaffolding, distributing stress and preventing tearing or stretching, especially when the mold is eventually removed from the original sculpture. Imagine trying to pull a rubber glove off your hand. It stretches and distorts. Now imagine that glove had tiny threads woven through it. It would hold its shape much better. The application of these strength layers is not a race. Oh no, my friend, haste is the enemy of perfection in this craft. Each layer needs time to kick off or partially cure before the next is applied. If you apply a fresh, wet layer onto one that is still too liquid, the weight could cause slumping, distorting the delicate details beneath. If you wait too long, the previous layer might fully cure and become too slick for the new material to bond effectively, leading to weak spots or, again, delamination. It's a Goldilocks scenario, not too wet, not too dry, but just right. This requires patience, keen observation, and an almost intuitive understanding of your chosen material's curing properties. Sometimes, you might step away for an hour or two, letting the chemistry do its slow, silent work, perhaps grabbing a cup of tea or pondering the mysteries of the universe. The thickness you build up depends on the size and complexity of the sculpture. For a small, simple bust, a few layers might suffice. For a life-size, highly articulated figure, you might build up a mold that is several centimeters thick in places, particularly in areas prone to stress or requiring extra rigidity. You're essentially creating a custom-fitted, multi-layered suit of armor for the initial impression layer. It's a bit like wrapping a precious gift. You don't just use one sheet of paper, do you? You add layers, tape, maybe some bubble wrap, all to protect what's inside. Dealing with undercuts and complex forms during this stage requires continued vigilance. As you build up thickness, you must ensure that the material still fills every crevice and doesn't bridge over any concave areas, trapping air bubbles. You might need to use a smaller tool, or even your finger, to gently push the material into those tricky spots, coaxing it into full contact with the layer beneath. It's a constant battle against the insidious air bubble, which, if left unchecked, can create voids in your mold that will translate into unsightly bumps on your eventual cast. It's like trying to get toothpaste into every corner of your toothbrush bristles, surprisingly difficult. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the importance of these layers is the widespread use of plaster casts in ancient Rome. While many original Greek bronze sculptures have been lost to time, we know them today largely through Roman marble copies. However, historians still argue whether these Roman copies were always direct carvings from live models or if many were themselves made from plaster casts taken from the original Greek bronzes, allowing for more efficient reproduction and distribution across the vast Roman Empire. The ability to create durable, multi-layered molds was fundamental to this process, enabling the preservation and dissemination of artistic forms across millennia. A quirky tidbit related to this process involves some of the early techniques for plaster reinforcement. Believe it or not, some ancient and even medieval mold makers incorporated horsehair or straw into their plaster mixes for strength. While we're mostly talking about flexible mold materials here, the principle of adding fibers for tensile strength is the same. Imagine trying to work with a silicone mold reinforced with horsehair. That would certainly add a unique texture, perhaps not ideal for capturing delicate details, but certainly robust. It makes you appreciate the smooth, uniform materials we have today. The structural integrity you're building is paramount to preventing distortion. A flexible mold, by its very nature, wants to flex. If it's not thick enough or adequately reinforced, it can sag, stretch, or warp under its own weight or during the demolding process. This is especially critical for large, unsupported areas or thin projections on the sculpture. The strength layers act as a kind of internal skeleton, holding the shape precisely as it was captured by the first impression layer. You are, in essence, creating a perfectly rigid yet still flexible skin for your sculpture. As you near the desired thickness, you might begin to think about the outer shell, the mother mold, that will eventually encase this flexible beauty. While we won't get into the specifics of making the mother mold just yet, these final strength layers are crucial for providing a stable, uniform surface for the mother mold to register against. You're creating a robust, outer skin for your flexible mold, preparing it for the next stage of its evolution. It's a bit like putting on a wetsuit before you put on your scuba gear. Each layer serves a distinct purpose, building towards the final functional form. If you've ever tried to pick up a wet noodle, you know how important a rigid outer support can be. You monitor the curing process closely, perhaps by touching a small, inconspicuous area or a test piece you've set aside. The material will transition from tacky to firm, from pliable to resilient. You'll notice the subtle heat generated by the exothermic reaction of some materials, a silent testament to the molecular bonds forming within. It's a slow, deliberate dance with chemistry, where patience is your most valuable partner. You learn to read the nuances of your material, understanding its moods and its timelines. By the time you've finished applying these strength layers, your flexible mold will feel substantial, almost like a second skin over the sculpture, but one that is thick, robust, and capable of holding its form. It should feel solid, yet still possess the inherent flexibility of your chosen material. You've transformed a delicate imprint into a durable, self-supporting structure, ready for the next critical phase. You've successfully mummified your sculpture, not to preserve it from decay, but to preserve its form for reproduction. And unlike an actual mummy, this one won't give you the creeps when you touch it. Now you stand at a fascinating precipice, the point where the delicate, supple skin of your flexible mold, that silicone or gelatin marvel you so painstakingly applied, needs a proper spine. Imagine trying to pour a perfectly sculpted jelly into a flimsy plastic bag and expecting it to hold its shape. Disaster, right? That's precisely why you embark on the crucial endeavor of constructing the mother mold, an unyielding outer shell, typically fashioned from plaster, designed to cradle and maintain the precise contours of your precious inner impression. This isn't just about support. It's about providing the structural integrity that will prevent your flexible mold from distorting under the weight of the upcoming plaster pour, ensuring your final replica emerges with the fidelity of a photographic memory. You see, your beautiful, bendy mold, for all its detail-capturing prowess, is inherently floppy. It's like a world-class gymnast, incredibly flexible and capable of amazing feats, but utterly reliant on the floor for support. The mother mold is that floor, a rigid exoskeleton that will hold your flexible mold in its exact, intended configuration. Think of it as the ultimate custom-fit corset for your artwork. Without it, your carefully captured details would sag, warp, and become a sad, amorphous blob, more reminiscent of a melted candle than a classical masterpiece. And nobody wants a melted candle version of the Venus de Milo, do they? Unless you're going for a very niche, avant-garde art installation, in which case, carry on, you rebel. The material of choice for this steadfast guardian is, more often than not, plaster. Why plaster? Because it's affordable, readily available, sets relatively quickly, and crucially, it's compatible with the casting process. It also offers a beautiful tactile experience, a cool, smooth paste that warms as it cures, a subtle alchemy unfolding right in your hands. You begin by carefully assessing the topography of your flexible mold. Just as you strategize sections for the inner mold, you must do the same for the mother mold, especially if your sculpture is complex or large. Dividing the mother mold into manageable sections ensures that it can be removed easily from the flexible mold once cured, and then reassembled with precision when it's time to cast. You'll start by creating what are known as keys or registration marks. These are ingenious little indentations or protrusions on the edges of each mother mold section that interlock perfectly with their neighbors, ensuring that when you reassemble the mother mold, every piece clicks into its exact, predetermined position. Think of them as the custom-designed puzzle pieces of your casting operation, guaranteeing seamless alignment. You might sculpt small, rounded bumps or carve out corresponding depressions directly into the wet plaster of one section, which will then create inverse shapes in the plaster of the adjacent section as it's applied. It's a bit like making a custom Lego set, but instead of primary colors and plastic, you're working with the elegant simplicity of gypsum. These keys are absolutely vital. Without them, your mother mold sections would be like a stack of slippery fish, never quite finding their true home, leading to misaligned casts. Now, with your keys planned, you prepare to mix your plaster for the mother mold. This plaster is often a stronger, denser variety than what you might use for the final cast, designed for structural integrity rather than fine detail. You measure your water and plaster powder with the same meticulous care you'd use for a delicate recipe, sprinkling the plaster into the water, allowing it to slake or absorb the liquid before gently mixing it into a creamy, lump-free consistency. You want it thick enough to hold its form but fluid enough to capture the necessary details of the flexible mold's exterior. There's a satisfying sensory experience to this. The fine dust in the air, the cool water, the gritty feel as the powder transforms under your mixing tool. And then, the subtle warmth as the chemical reaction begins, signaling its impending set. You begin to apply the plaster to your flexible mold, typically in layers. The first layer is often a thinner, wash, coat, brushed on to ensure it intimately contacts the surface of the flexible mold and captures any subtle undulations or key markings. Subsequent layers are thicker, building up the necessary bulk and strength. For larger or more complex mother molds, you might embed reinforcing materials within the plaster layers. Historically, casters often used burlap, hemp fibers, or even horsehair to add tensile strength to their plaster molds, much like rebar reinforces concrete today. This practice dates back centuries, as artisans realized early on that plain plaster, while strong in compression, could be brittle and prone to cracking under stress. This reinforcement is especially important for areas that might experience strain during handling or the demolding process. As you build up the layers, you're creating a shell. As you near the desired thickness, you might begin to think about the outer shell, the mother mold, that will eventually encase this flexible beauty. While we won't get into the specifics of making the mother mold just yet, these final strength layers are crucial for providing a stable, uniform surface for the mother mold to register against. You're creating a robust, outer skin for your flexible mold, preparing it for the next stage of its evolution. It's a bit like putting on a wetsuit before you put on your scuba gear. Each layer serves a distinct purpose, building towards the final functional form. If you've ever tried to pick up a wet noodle, you know how important a rigid outer support can be. You monitor the curing process closely, perhaps by touching a small, inconspicuous area or a test piece you've set aside. The material will transition from tacky to firm, from pliable to resilient. You'll notice the subtle heat generated by the exothermic reaction of some materials, a silent testament to the molecular bonds forming within. It's a slow, deliberate dance with chemistry, where patience is your most valuable partner. You learn to read the nuances of your material, understanding its moods and its timelines. By the time you've finished applying these strength layers, your flexible mold will feel substantial, almost like a second skin over the sculpture, but one that is thick, robust, and capable of holding its form. It should feel solid, yet still possess the inherent flexibility of your chosen material. You've transformed a delicate imprint into a durable, self-supporting structure, ready for the next critical phase. You've successfully mummified your sculpture, not to preserve it from decay, but to preserve its form for reproduction. And unlike an actual mummy, this one won't give you the creeps when you touch it. Now you stand at a fascinating precipice, the point where the delicate, supple skin of your flexible mold, that silicone or gelatin marvel you so painstakingly applied, needs a proper spine. Imagine trying to pour a perfectly sculpted jelly into a flimsy plastic bag and expecting it to hold its shape. Disaster, right? That's precisely why you embark on the crucial endeavor of constructing the mother mold, an unyielding outer shell, typically fashioned from plaster, designed to cradle and maintain the precise contours of your precious inner impression. This isn't just about support. It's about providing the structural integrity that will prevent your flexible mold from distorting under the weight of the upcoming plaster pour, ensuring your final replica emerges with the fidelity of a photographic memory. You see, your beautiful, bendy mold, for all its detail-capturing prowess, is inherently floppy. It's like a world-class gymnast, incredibly flexible and capable of amazing feats, but utterly reliant on the floor for support. The mother mold is that floor, a rigid exoskeleton that will hold your flexible mold in its exact, intended configuration. Think of it as the ultimate custom-fit corset for your artwork. Without it, your carefully captured details would sag, warp, and become a sad, amorphous blob, more reminiscent of a melted candle than a classical masterpiece. And nobody wants a melted candle version of the Venus de Milo, do they? Unless you're going for a very niche, avant-garde art installation, in which case, carry on, you rebel. The material of choice for this steadfast guardian is, more often than not, plaster. Why plaster? Because it's affordable, readily available, sets relatively quickly, and crucially, it's compatible with the casting process. It also offers a beautiful tactile experience, a cool, smooth paste that warms as it cures, a subtle alchemy unfolding right in your hands. You begin by carefully assessing the topography of your flexible mold. Just as you strategize sections for the inner mold, you must do the same for the mother mold, especially if your sculpture is complex or large. Dividing the mother mold into manageable sections ensures that it can be removed easily from the flexible mold once cured, and then reassembled with precision when it's time to cast. You'll start by creating what are known as keys or registration marks. These are ingenious little indentations or protrusions on the edges of each mother mold section that interlock perfectly with their neighbors, ensuring that when you reassemble the mother mold, every piece clicks into its exact, predetermined position. Think of them as the custom-designed puzzle pieces of your casting operation, guaranteeing seamless alignment. You might sculpt small, rounded bumps or carve out corresponding depressions directly into the wet plaster of one section, which will then create inverse shapes in the plaster of the adjacent section as it's applied. It's a bit like making a custom Lego set, but instead of primary colors and plastic, you're working with the elegant simplicity of gypsum. These keys are absolutely vital. Without them, your mother mold sections would be like a stack of slippery fish, never quite finding their true home, leading to misaligned casts. Now, with your keys planned, you prepare to mix your plaster for the mother mold. This plaster is often a stronger, denser variety than what you might use for the final cast, designed for structural integrity rather than fine detail. You measure your water and plaster powder with the same meticulous care you'd use for a delicate recipe, sprinkling the plaster into the water, allowing it to slake or absorb the liquid before gently mixing it into a creamy, lump-free consistency. You want it thick enough to hold its form but fluid enough to capture the necessary details of the flexible mold's exterior. There's a satisfying sensory experience to this: the fine dust in the air, the cool water, the gritty feel as the powder transforms under your mixing tool. And then, the subtle warmth as the chemical reaction begins, signaling its impending set. You begin to apply the plaster to your flexible mold, typically in layers. The first layer is often a thinner wash coat, brushed on to ensure it intimately contacts the surface of the flexible mold and captures any subtle undulations or key markings. Subsequent layers are thicker, building up the necessary bulk and strength. For larger or more complex mother molds, you might embed reinforcing materials within the plaster layers. Historically, casters often used burlap, hemp fibers, or even horsehair to add tensile strength to their plaster molds, much like rebar reinforces concrete today. This practice dates back centuries, as artisans realized early on that plain plaster, while strong in compression, could be brittle and prone to cracking under stress. This reinforcement is especially important for areas that might experience strain during handling or the demolding process. As you build up the layers, you're creating a shell that is typically an inch or more thick, depending on the size and complexity of the original sculpture. You work methodically, section by section, ensuring each piece of the mother mold is robust enough to stand on its own. If you're building a multi-part mother mold, you'll apply a thin layer of a release agent, petroleum jelly, soap solution, or specialized mold release, to the plaster edges of the first section before applying the plaster for the next section. This ensures they don't fuse together, allowing for clean separation once cured. It's a bit like preparing a cake tin, but on a much grander, more sculptural scale. You're constantly mindful of the keys you've established, making sure the plaster flows into them cleanly to create perfect interlocking forms. The curing process for plaster is fascinating. It starts with an exothermic reaction, meaning it generates heat as it hardens. You can often feel the warmth radiating from the mold as it sets, a clear sign that the magic is happening. Once the plaster has fully hardened, which can take anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, depending on the type of plaster and ambient conditions, you gently begin the delicate process of separating the mother mold sections from the flexible inner mold. This requires a steady hand and a great deal of patience. You might use wooden wedges or plastic shims to carefully pry the sections apart, listening for the satisfying pop that signals a clean release. It's a moment of quiet triumph, revealing the perfectly formed, rigid shell you've created. You then carefully lift each section of the mother mold away, revealing the flexible mold beneath, which now looks a little less like a deflated balloon and more like a proud, self-supporting structure. You inspect your handiwork, the crisp edges of the keys, the smooth interior of the mother mold, the absence of any cracks or flaws. This rigid plaster exoskeleton is what will protect your flexible mold from the immense pressure of the liquid plaster you'll soon pour to create the final replica. Without this supportive shell, the flexible mold would deform under the weight, leading to a distorted, unusable cast. Historians still argue whether the shift from entirely rigid plaster piece molds to the use of flexible inner molds supported by plaster mother molds was a gradual evolution or a more punctuated revolution in casting techniques. While flexible materials like gelatin and rubber gained prominence in the 19th and 20th centuries, the concept of a rigid outer shell for support was always critical, even for earlier, more complex piece molds made entirely of plaster. The British Museum, for instance, has been making plaster casts for centuries, and their historical records show a continuous refinement of these support structures. A quirky tidbit: some early casters, especially those working with extremely fragile originals, would sometimes apply a thin layer of plaster directly to the original sculpture itself to create a rigid outer shell, before applying a flexible inner layer. This was incredibly risky and could damage the original, but it speaks to the desperate need for a rigid support system. Thankfully, modern materials and techniques have made such drastic measures unnecessary. The construction of the mother mold is a testament to foresight and precision. It's not the glamorous part of the process, perhaps, but it's the unsung hero, the quiet workhorse that ensures everything else falls into place. It's the architectural blueprint rendered in gypsum, holding the promise of the perfect reproduction. You carefully store your mother mold sections, perhaps labeling them with a soft pencil to ensure proper reassembly later. Each section feels substantial, a tangible result of your focused effort. You might even find yourself admiring the subtle texture of the plaster, the way it captures the light, a piece of art in its own right, albeit one designed for a purely utilitarian purpose. You're building the bedrock, the unshakable foundation for the grand reveal that is still to come. The quiet hum of your own satisfaction fills the air, a gentle lullaby to a job meticulously done. And so you arrive, not at a destination, but at a precipice. The air in the workshop, which moments ago hummed with the quiet industry of drying plaster and curing silicone, now feels different, thicker, charged. You've journeyed through the careful cleaning, the strategic sectioning, the meticulous layering, and now, finally, after what feels like a geological epoch of waiting for everything to set and cure, you stand at the threshold of the great unveiling. This, my friend, is the moment of truth. The careful separation from original. You might find yourself holding your breath without even realizing it, a silent, almost reverent anticipation hanging in the air. It's a bit like that moment when you're trying to peel a particularly stubborn sticker off a pristine surface, knowing that one wrong move could leave behind a sticky residue, or, worse, tear the thing you're trying to protect. Except, instead of a sticker, you have a priceless piece of art, and instead of residue, you could potentially have a chipped nose on a Roman emperor. No pressure, though. Just don't sneeze. Or breathe too loudly. Or think about anything too exciting. Your gaze sweeps over the the final piece of the flexible mold peels away, and there it stands, the original sculpture, bathed in the workshop light, utterly unharmed, looking as if it had simply taken a very long, very refreshing bath. You let out that breath you've been holding, a quiet sigh of relief that echoes the subtle sound of the mold's release. It's a moment of profound satisfaction. You've successfully navigated the most precarious stage, ensuring the integrity of the masterpiece for generations to come. The flexible mold, now free, lies open, a perfect negative impression, ready to welcome the plaster that will soon form its positive counterpart. The original, meanwhile, stands ready to resume its place, perhaps in a museum, perhaps in a quiet gallery, utterly unaware of the meticulous journey it just undertook. You, however, are keenly aware, and a quiet sense of accomplishment settles over you, like a warm blanket after a long, tense day. You've done it. You've brought the precious mold back to your workshop, a tangible, tactile echo of the masterpiece you so painstakingly replicated. The air, still thick with the ghost of anticipation from the separation, now holds a different kind of quiet. This is the calm before the pour, the moment where you transition from creating the negative to coaxing forth the positive. It's a bit like finally getting home after a long journey, kicking off your shoes, and realizing you still have to unpack the entire suitcase. But this unpacking, this is an art form unto itself. The first, most fundamental step in this next phase is a meticulous, almost obsessive, act of purification, cleaning the mold. Imagine, if you will, the microscopic landscape within your newly formed mold cavity. Even though you were incredibly careful during the separation, tiny fragments of the original sculpture's surface, stray dust motes, or even minuscule flakes of the mold material itself might linger. These aren't just minor annoyances, they are saboteurs, waiting patiently to mar the pristine surface of your future cast. Think of it like trying to bake a soufflé in a pan with a rogue sprinkle of glitter stuck to the bottom. It might look pretty in a disco ball sort of way, but it's certainly not what you intended. You begin with a soft, almost imperceptible whisper of compressed air. Not a harsh, industrial blast that could damage delicate details, but a gentle sigh, like a soft breath against a window pane. This initial pass dislodges any loose, larger particles. You hold the mold up to the light, turning it slowly, allowing the illumination to catch any dancing specks. It's a meditative process, watching the dust motes twirl and disappear. Then, you reach for the softest brushes you possess, often camel hair or sable, the kind an artist uses for the most delicate strokes. With a touch lighter than a butterfly's kiss, you gently sweep every curve, every crevice, every intricate undercut. You're not scrubbing, you're coaxing. You're removing the invisible, the nearly there. It's like tidying up your digital desktop, deleting all those ancient downloads you didn't even remember having, ensuring everything is perfectly pristine. A stray hair, a tiny fiber from your clothes, even a fingerprint, could leave an impression on the final plaster, a permanent testament to your momentary lapse in vigilance. And trust me, you don't want your future replica of the Venus de Milo to sport your thumbprint on her, well, anywhere. Once you are absolutely, unequivocally certain that the mold is as clean as a freshly laundered thought, you move on to the next critical stage, sealing. Now, why seal a mold that already feels perfectly smooth and finished? Good question, my friend, and the answer lies in the very nature of plaster. Plaster, when mixed, is a water-based slurry. And many of the mold materials we discussed earlier, particularly the more traditional ones like gelatin or even some early rubbers, possess a degree of porosity. They are, in essence, thirsty. If you were to pour wet plaster directly into an unsealed mold, two undesirable things could happen. Firstly, the mold material might absorb some of the water from the plaster, leading to an uneven cure, a weakened cast, or even worse, a permanent adhesion between the two. Imagine trying to peel a very wet sticker off a slightly damp surface. It just doesn't work. Secondly, certain chemical reactions could occur between the raw plaster and the mold, leading to sticking or surface defects. So, you apply a sealant. Historically, one of the most common and effective sealants was shellac. This natural resin, derived from the lac insect, has been used for centuries in various crafts, from wood finishing to food glazing, and yes, to mold preparation. It forms a hard, impermeable barrier. You take a fine brush, perhaps the same soft one you used for cleaning, and with slow, deliberate strokes, you begin to paint the interior of the mold. This isn't a slapdash job, it's a careful, almost surgical application. You want an incredibly thin, even coat. Too thick, and you risk obscuring the minute details you worked so hard to capture. Too thin, and it won't provide an effective barrier. It's like applying the perfect amount of topcoat to a freshly painted nail, just enough to protect, not so much it becomes gloopy. You apply one thin layer, allowing it to dry completely. This isn't a rush job. Patience, remember, is your most trusted companion on this journey. The shellac will dry to a hard, glossy film, often with a faint, sweet sharp scent that hangs in the air, a subtle perfume of preservation. Depending on the mold material and the specific shellac, you might apply 2 or even 3 such thin coats, ensuring every single millimeter of the mold cavity is sealed. Each layer needs to dry fully before the next. This waiting period can feel interminable, especially when you're eager to see the final product, but rushing it is akin to trying to skip steps in a complex recipe. You're just inviting disaster. Historians still argue whether the optimal drying time for shellac in humid environments truly impacted the long-term integrity of historical casts, with some advocating for extended curing periods and others prioritizing efficiency. But in your workshop, you err on the side of caution. You let it dry. You might even play a round of your favorite mobile game, or perhaps just close your eyes and drift into a gentle, pre-sleep reverie, letting the quiet hum of the workshop be your lullaby. Once the sealant has cured to a flawless, non-tacky finish, you move on to the final, arguably most critical, layer of preparation, the release agent. This is your insurance policy, your non-stick coating, the magical barrier that ensures your freshly poured plaster cast will separate cleanly and beautifully from the mold. Without it, you'd be left with a very expensive, very frustrating, and very permanent plaster mold hybrid. It's like trying to get a perfectly baked cake out of a pan that wasn't greased. You're just going to end up with a delicious mess and a lot of emotional damage. The choice of release agent depends heavily on the mold material and the desired finish. For silicone molds, which are inherently nonstick, you might use a very light, almost imperceptible spray of silicone oil or a specialized commercial release agent. For traditional plaster molds, or even some gelatin molds, you might opt for a more classic solution. One quirky tidbit from history involves the use of specific soap solutions. Not just any soap, mind you, but a particular kind of soft soap, often made from olive oil or other vegetable fats, diluted to a precise consistency. This soap solution, when carefully applied and allowed to dry, leaves a microscopic film that prevents the plaster from adhering. Imagine painting the inside of your mold with a very thin, almost invisible layer of soap suds. It sounds simple, but the chemistry is surprisingly elegant. Other historical methods included various oils, waxes, or even a blend of both, often warmed slightly to ensure an even spread. You take your chosen release agent and, once again, with the utmost care, begin to apply it. If it's a liquid, you use a very soft brush, ensuring every single surface, every tiny detail, every undercut is coated. You want a thin, even layer, slick to the touch, but with absolutely no pooling. Pooling means excess, and excess means blemishes on your final cast. Think of it like applying a very sheer layer of lip balm, enough to do the job, but not so much that it feels goopy. If it's a spray, you stand back slightly, ensuring a fine mist settles evenly across the entire surface. You might even use a soft, dry brush to gently wick away any excess, leaving behind only the most microscopic, effective film. You run your finger lightly over the surface, with a clean, gloved hand, of course, feeling the slickness, the promise of easy release. It's like the satisfying feeling of knowing your perfectly buttered baking dish is ready for that masterpiece of a casserole. This stage is where the anticipation truly begins to build. The mold, now clean, sealed, and lubricated, sits before you, an empty promise. It's a silent invitation, waiting to be filled. You've prepared the stage, set the scene, and ensured every single element is in its perfect place. The air around you, once again, is still, but now it hums with the unspoken excitement of what's to come. You've taught the plaster its boundaries. Now, it's time for it to learn its form. You stand poised, a quiet reverence settling over the workshop. The meticulously prepared mold, an empty promise of form, awaits its transformation. But before you can coax that promise into being, you must master the very heart of this ancient craft, the perfect mix. This isn't just about combining ingredients, it's a delicate dance, a chemical ballet, where every whisper of powder, every drop of water matters. This, my friend, is the science of plaster mixing. Think of it like baking the most exquisite, delicate cake you've ever imagined, only instead of sugar and flour, you're working with a fine, white powder that holds the memory of geological time. The star of our show, the humble plaster of Paris, is actually a fascinating substance known scientifically as calcium sulfate hemihydrate. Sounds fancy, doesn't it? But really, it's just gypsum, a common mineral, that's been heated to remove some of its water content. When you reintroduce water, it eagerly soaks it up, reforming its original gypsum structure. This process isn't just a simple dissolution, it's a crystallization, a microscopic architecture building itself right before your eyes, hardening as it does. It's quite literally rock formation, sped up for your artistic convenience. Now you might think, just dump the powder in the water, stir, and go, right? Oh, if only it were that simple. This is where the precise measurement aspect of our journey becomes less a suggestion and more a sacred commandment. The water-to-plaster ratio is utterly paramount. Too much water, and your cast will be weak, chalky, prone to crumbling, and might even shrink excessively as it dries. Imagine pouring a magnificent replica of the Venus de Milo, only for her arm to snap off because you were a bit too generous with the H2O. A tragedy, wouldn't you agree? Too little water, conversely, and your plaster will be thick, lumpy, unworkable, and impossible to pour into the intricate details of your mold. It'll seize up like a forgotten concrete mixer on a hot day, leaving you with a half-formed, frustrating mess. You'd be left with a cast of, well, half the Venus de Milo, which, while perhaps an interesting artistic statement, isn't quite what we're aiming for. The ideal consistency is often described as resembling a thick cream, or perhaps a perfectly blended milkshake, smooth, pourable, but with enough body to hold its form. Achieving this requires precise measurement, typically by weight, not volume. While it might be tempting to eyeball it or use a measuring cup, the density of plaster powder can vary, and volume measurements are notoriously inaccurate for fine powders. So, you'll reach for your trusty digital scale, measuring out your water and plaster with the kind of meticulousness usually reserved for pharmaceutical compounding. This isn't just about getting this cast right, it's about reproducibility. If you ever need to make another copy, or if you're working on a multi-part cast that needs perfectly matched sections, consistent mixing is your best friend. Now for the careful mixing part. This is where the sleepy ASMR cadence truly comes into play. You begin by pouring your precisely measured water into a clean, flexible mixing bowl. Then, with a gentle, almost meditative motion, you begin to sift the plaster powder into the water. Don't dump it all in at once. That's a surefire way to create stubborn lumps, like uninvited guests at a very important party. Instead, let the fine powder drift down, settling onto the surface of the water, slowly absorbing it. You'll see little islands of white forming, then sinking, as the water begins its work. This initial phase, sometimes called the slaking or soaking period, is crucial. It allows the plaster particles to fully saturate, minimizing the air that gets trapped between them. It's like letting tea leaves steep before you stir them. Patience is key. Once most of the plaster has settled beneath the surface, you begin to mix. And here's the trick: you mix slowly and deliberately. This isn't a frantic whisking session for a soufflé. You use a spatula or a mixing stick, gently folding and stirring from the bottom up, coaxing the remaining dry bits into the slurry. The goal is to avoid incorporating air bubbles. Every vigorous stir, every rapid whisk, introduces tiny pockets of air, which will manifest as unsightly pinholes on the surface of your finished cast. Imagine the majestic beard of a Zeus sculpture, riddled with tiny craters, not quite the look we're going for. So you stir with a calm, even rhythm, watching as the mixture transforms from a watery suspension to that coveted creamy consistency. You might even feel a subtle warmth emanating from the bowl. This is the exothermic reaction, the chemical process of the plaster hardening, releasing a small amount of heat. It's a gentle reminder that the magic is truly happening. Historically, the use of plaster for casting is far from new. Ancient Egyptians, for example, were masters of plaster, using it for everything from wall reliefs to funerary masks. They understood its properties well, even if they didn't have digital scales or chemical formulas written out. Plaster casts of the deceased were sometimes used as templates for sarcophagus lids, ensuring a perfect likeness. Later, the Romans and Greeks used plaster extensively for architectural decoration and, crucially, for replicating their bronze and marble masterpieces. In fact, many of the classical sculptures we admire today, especially those from antiquity, are known to us primarily through plaster casts made during the Renaissance, when European artists traveled to Rome to study the ancient ruins. These casts were often the only way for artists in distant lands to study the classical forms. A quirky tidbit for you: during the Victorian era, it became quite fashionable to create plaster death masks of famous individuals, poets, politicians, even royalty. These weren't just morbid curiosities. They were seen as a way to preserve the exact likeness of a person for posterity, a tangible link to their physical presence. Imagine a shelf lined with the plaster faces of Dickens, Napoleon, or even Beethoven. It's a bit eerie, perhaps, but certainly a unique form of historical preservation, made possible by the very process we're discussing. While the basic principles of plaster mixing have remained consistent for millennia, historians still argue whether specific ancient civilizations possessed secret additives or unique gypsum sources that allowed for superior plaster quality or faster setting times. Was there a Roman superplaster that allowed for more durable casts, or was it simply the result of perfectly pure gypsum and refined techniques passed down through generations? The debate continues to gently hum along in academic circles. As you continue to mix, you'll notice the texture changing, becoming smoother, more viscous. Lift your spatula and let the plaster drizzle back into the bowl. Does it flow like heavy cream, leaving a slight mound on the surface that slowly settles? Does it coat the spatula evenly without dripping too quickly? This is the consistency you're seeking. Any lumps or dry powder clinging to the sides of the bowl should be gently scraped down and folded in. This is your working time, the window during which the plaster remains pourable before it begins to set. It's often surprisingly short, usually just a few minutes, depending on the type of plaster and the water temperature. So, while you must be careful, you also need to be efficient. Think of it as a culinary challenge where you have to perfectly prepare a delicate batter, knowing that the oven is already preheated and waiting. Just don't try to eat this batter, it's not quite as tasty as it looks. The consequences of improper mixing extend beyond just aesthetics. Air bubbles, as mentioned, are the bane of any plaster caster. They can create unsightly pockmarks on the surface, but more critically, they can weaken the structural integrity of the cast, especially in delicate areas. Lumps can lead to inconsistent density, creating weak spots that are prone to cracking. An improperly mixed batch might also suffer from excessive shrinkage as it dries, distorting the replica. It's a bit like trying to build a magnificent sandcastle with sand that's either too wet or too dry. The structural integrity simply isn't there. You've done it. The plaster in your bowl is a smooth, homogeneous, creamy delight. It's warm to the touch, a living substance ready to embrace the void of your mold. The quiet hum of the workshop feels a little warmer now, a little more alive, as you prepare for the next, equally crucial step. Alright, so you've meticulously prepared your mold, an intricate negative space waiting patiently. You've mixed your plaster to that perfect, creamy consistency, a liquid promise of form. Now, we arrive at the moment of truth, the quiet crescendo of this entire, painstaking process, pouring the replica cast. This isn't like haphazardly filling a bucket with water. Oh no, this is a ballet of gravity and precision, a whisper-quiet commitment to every single crevice. You lift your container of freshly mixed plaster, feeling its surprisingly weighty presence, the warmth already beginning to emanate from its depths as the chemical reaction subtly kicks off. Your gaze is fixed on the prepared mold, perhaps nestled securely in a sandbox or a custom cradle to ensure perfect stability. You take a breath, a slow, deliberate intake of air, and then, with the utmost care, you begin to pour. The first trickle of liquid plaster descends, a pale, milky stream, aiming not for the very center of the mold, but often for the lowest point, or perhaps along an edge where the plaster can gently cascade and spread. Think of it like pouring a really, really expensive, very thick milkshake into a delicate glass. You want it to flow smoothly, without sloshing or splashing. The goal here is to let the plaster flow into the mold, rather than simply splashing down onto it. This technique, sometimes called washing the mold, allows the plaster to coat the inner surface first, pushing any tiny air bubbles that might be clinging to the mold walls up and away. You're letting gravity, your silent and ever-present assistant, do most of the work, coaxing the plaster to creep slowly, deliberately, into every nook and cranny. You watch as it seeks out the contours, flowing around the ghostly impression of a finger, or filling the delicate folds of a drapery, like a miniature, slow-motion tidal wave. As the level of the plaster begins to rise within the mold, you might introduce a gentle vibration. Not a violent shake, mind you, we're not trying to make a plaster earthquake here, but a subtle, rhythmic tapping of the mold's outer shell, or the table it rests upon. Sometimes, you'll even see experienced casters use a rubber mallet, tapping the sides of the mother mold with a soft, dull thud. This gentle percussive action is your secret weapon against the insidious enemy of all casting, the air bubble. These tiny pockets of nothingness, if trapped against the mold's surface, will manifest as unsightly pockmarks or voids on your finished cast, marring the perfect replica you've worked so hard to create. It's like trying to get every last air bubble out of a screen protector on your phone, only on a much grander and more permanent scale. You might even tilt and rotate the mold ever so slightly, encouraging the liquid plaster to flow into particularly stubborn undercuts or deep recesses. Imagine trying to get jam into every ridge of a really fancy, decorative cookie cutter. It requires a bit of finesse, doesn't it? For particularly intricate details, like the delicate tendrils of hair on a classical bust or the minute veins on a leaf, you might even use a soft brush, gently painting the plaster into those areas before the main pour continues. This ensures that the first contact between the plaster and the mold surface is complete and bubble-free, capturing every single, microscopic detail. It's a bit like giving your sculpture a very thorough, very slow, and very liquid bath. As the plaster continues to fill the mold, rising steadily, you maintain that slow, consistent pour. You're listening, too, though perhaps only your inner ear can truly discern it, for the subtle sounds of the plaster displacing air, the faint whisper of it finding its new home. You're watching for any signs of resistance, any areas where the plaster seems hesitant to flow. If you see a bubble stubbornly clinging to a surface, you might gently prod it with a thin wire or a long, slender brush, coaxing it to release and rise to the surface. It's a delicate dance, this push and pull, a constant negotiation with the laws of fluid dynamics. When the mold is finally full, the liquid plaster cresting just at the top of the opening, you stop. The surface will likely be smooth, perhaps with a few lingering bubbles slowly popping and dissipating. This is the moment where you might give the mold one final, gentle series of taps, just to be absolutely sure. Then you wait. This isn't a passive wait, however. You're observing the transformation, a quiet miracle unfolding before your eyes. The plaster, which moments ago was a fluid, flowing substance, now begins its rapid chemical transformation. You can often feel the mold warm slightly in your hands. This is the exothermic reaction, the heat generated as the calcium sulfate hemihydrate crystals rehydrate and interlock, forming gypsum. It's a fascinating, if subtle, phenomenon, and a testament to the science behind this ancient art. This warmth signals that the plaster is setting, or kicking, beginning its journey from liquid to solid. In a relatively short time, perhaps 30 minutes to an hour depending on the specific plaster mix and ambient conditions, the plaster will go from liquid to a firm, unyielding mass. You'll see the surface lose its wet sheen, becoming dull and opaque. It's truly a race against time in chemistry. Once the plaster starts to set, you cannot disturb it. Any movement, any jostling, will disrupt the forming crystal structure, weakening the final cast and potentially causing hairline cracks or internal voids. So, once you've poured, your job becomes one of vigilant stillness. Now, while you're patiently waiting for your plaster to set, let's consider something rather fascinating. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of plaster casts ultimately democratized art education by making classical forms accessible to all students, or if it inadvertently devalued the original masterpieces by reducing them to mere reproducible objects. It's a complex debate, isn't it? On one hand, plaster casts were absolutely instrumental in the training of artists for centuries. For example, during the Renaissance and well into the 19th century, art academies across Europe, like the Royal Academy in London or the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, boasted extensive cast courts. Students would spend countless hours meticulously drawing from these plaster replicas of ancient Greek and Roman sculptures, learning anatomy, proportion, and the ideals of classical beauty without ever needing to travel to Italy or Greece. It was the original art school curriculum in a box, if you will, bringing the grandeur of antiquity to aspiring artists in chilly northern climes. It's also worth noting a quirky little tidbit. Some of the earliest plaster casts weren't even of human figures. Ancient Egyptians and Romans actually used plaster extensively for things like death masks, yes, but also for architectural decoration, and even as a form of instant replay for crime scenes. Imagine, if you will, a Roman investigator carefully pouring plaster into a muddy footprint at the scene of a theft, long before CSI Miami was even a twinkle in a TV producer's eye. This practice of casting footprints, tire tracks, and other impressions in plaster continues to be a vital tool in modern forensic science today. It's a testament to the enduring utility of this humble material, bridging millennia from ancient crime scenes to modern police work. So, while you're pouring plaster to recreate a Venus, someone else might be pouring it to recreate a suspect's shoe print, both equally meticulous in their own way. Back to our setting cast. You might even notice a subtle expansion as the plaster sets, a property that is actually quite beneficial. This slight expansion helps the plaster fill every last micro detail of the mold, resulting in a wonderfully crisp and accurate reproduction. It's like your cast is taking a deep breath and puffing out its chest, just a tiny bit, to perfectly fill its new skin. This is why plaster is so superior to many other materials for capturing fine detail. It doesn't shrink away from the mold's surface as it hardens. The waiting game is perhaps the hardest part for the impatient artist. You resist the urge to peek, to prod, to test its firmness. You've done your part, now chemistry and time must do theirs. You might even walk away for a bit, make yourself a cup of herbal tea, and contemplate the sheer audacity of what you're attempting to recreate, with mere dust and water, the very essence of a masterpiece. It's a quiet act of faith, really, that all your careful preparation, your precise mixing, and your deliberate pouring will culminate in success. The mold, now heavy with its new inhabitant, sits silently, a cocoon of creation, holding within it the promise of a new form, waiting patiently for its grand unveiling. And that, my friend, is a story for next time. Now you stand at the precipice of revelation. The plaster, once a swirling, creamy liquid, has undergone its quiet metamorphosis within the confines of your meticulously crafted mold. Time, that ever-patient sculptor, has done its work. The initial warmth of the exothermic reaction, that subtle heat indicating the plaster's setting, has long since dissipated, leaving behind a cool, inert mass. It's a waiting game, isn't it? Much like refreshing your tracking page every 5 minutes to see if that deeply coveted package has moved an inch. You resist the urge to peek, to prod, to rush the process, knowing that true beauty, like a perfectly baked soufflé or a well-aged cheese, demands its own unhurried timeline. The air in the workshop hangs heavy with anticipation, a silence so profound you can almost hear the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. You've allowed ample time, perhaps even a generous extra hour, just to be absolutely certain the plaster has fully cured, hardened to its optimal strength. There's no undoing a premature demolding. A soft, crumbling cast is a tragic sight, a testament to impatience. So you wait, perhaps sipping a mug of herbal tea, letting the steam warm your face, or idly wiping down a workbench, finding small tasks to occupy your hands while your mind races with possibilities. This is the moment when all those painstaking hours, all that careful planning and precise execution, culminate. This is the truth-telling moment. You approach the workbench, your movements slow, deliberate, almost reverent. The mother mold, that rigid outer shell, is the first to be addressed. Often made of plaster itself, or sometimes wood or even fiberglass, it's designed to be disassembled. You carefully locate the keys and joins, the very points you so thoughtfully engineered to ensure easy separation. A gentle tap here, a subtle leverage there, and you begin to loosen the screws or remove the clamps that hold it together. The sound, if any, is a soft, almost imperceptible creak as the plaster sections of the mother mold begin to yield. It's like unwrapping a particularly intricate present, where the paper itself is part of the art. As the sections of the mother mold are lifted away, piece by painstaking piece, they reveal the flexible inner mold beneath. This is where the real magic, and the real tension, lies. If you use silicone, it shimmers slightly, a supple, almost skin-like surface still clinging intimately to the new plaster form within. If you opted for a gelatin mold, it might have a slight, almost waxy sheen, its edges perhaps a tiny bit more delicate. You take a deep, slow breath, steadying your hands. This is the point of no return. Now comes the delicate dance of separation. With your specialized tools, perhaps a soft plastic spatula, or even just your fingertips, gloved for protection and to prevent transferring oils, you begin the careful process of peeling back the flexible mold. You start at an edge, a seam line that you meticulously plan during the sectioning phase. You apply gentle, even pressure, coaxing the mold away from the plaster. There's often a soft, almost ethereal whoosh or a faint, satisfying pop as the vacuum seal between the mold and the cast is broken. It's a sound that sends a shiver of nervous excitement down your spine, a tiny auditory confirmation that the release is happening. You work slowly, methodically, moving along the predetermined seam lines. For a multi-part flexible mold, you'll be peeling off one section at a time. Imagine carefully unzipping an invisible garment from your sculpture. Each peel reveals a little more of the emerging form, a tantalizing glimpse of the contours and details. You can already see the smooth, matte white surface of the plaster replica, starkly contrasting with the vibrant color of the silicone or the translucent amber of the gelatin. It's like watching a time-lapse video of a flower blooming, but in reverse. The air around you feels charged, a delicate balance of hope and trepidation. What if there's a stubborn bubble? What if a fine detail didn't fill completely? These are the anxieties that plague every caster in this moment. You continue to peel, your focus absolute, your movements as fluid and controlled as a surgeon's. You might even find yourself unconsciously holding your breath, only exhaling in a soft sigh of relief as another section of the mold comes free without incident. This careful separation is crucial. Any abrupt movement could chip or crack the still vulnerable plaster. As the last section of the mold is gently lifted away, the newly formed plaster replica stands before you in its entirety. It's a moment of profound satisfaction, a quiet triumph. The white form, fresh from its confinement, looks almost ethereal, a ghost of the original, yet solid and tangible. You might feel a surge of warmth, a sense of connection to the artisans of old who performed this very same unveiling centuries ago. Mainstream historical fact *: the practice of making plaster casts of sculptures dates back to antiquity, with evidence suggesting their use in ancient Greece and Rome for study and dissemination of artistic ideals. For example, Roman copyists frequently used casting techniques to reproduce popular Greek sculptures, effectively democratizing access to these masterpieces long before the advent of photography or 3D printing. You circle the piece slowly, your eyes scanning every curve, every crevice. You're looking for imperfections, of course, a tiny air bubble that stubbornly clung to the mold, leaving a pinprick hole, a faint seam line where the mold sections met, perhaps a slight irregularity in a particularly delicate feature. These are the birthmarks of a cast, the inevitable quirks of a complex process. But you also take in the overall form, the successful capture of the original's essence. It's a moment of critical appraisal, but also one of immense pride. There's a peculiar beauty in these fresh plaster casts. They lack the patina of age, the subtle color variations, or the deliberate finishes of their originals, yet they possess a raw, pristine quality. They are, in a sense, a blank canvas, ready for the next stage of artistry. Quirky tidbit *: some early casters, particularly in the Renaissance, believed that the sound of the mold separating from the cast could indicate the success of the pour. A clean, sharp pop or a gentle sigh was considered auspicious, while a dull thud might signal trouble. It was almost a form of mold whispering, a secret language known only to the most experienced hands. You might even lean in close, perhaps gently touching a smooth surface, feeling the cool, dry plaster beneath your fingertips. It's a tangible link to the past, a direct impression of a master's hand, now replicated through your own careful labor. This new cast, though a copy, holds its own unique narrative, a story of preservation and painstaking recreation. Open scholarly debate phrase * historians still debate whether the immediate post-demolding assessment of a cast's success was purely technical, focusing on the absence of flaws, or if it also encompassed an aesthetic judgment of its artistic merit as a faithful reproduction, even before any finishing work began. Was the goal simply fidelity, or was there an inherent artistic quality sought in the stark, white form itself? The joy of a successful demolding is profound, akin to cracking the code of an ancient puzzle. You've taken a complex, three-dimensional form, broken it down into its constituent parts, and then painstakingly reassembled it in a new material. And yet, even with the most advanced techniques, perfection remains an elusive ideal. It's a bit like trying to perfectly fold a fitted sheet. You get close, but there's always that one stubborn corner. But that's part of the charm, isn't it? The slight imperfections tell a story, too. You gently lift the new cast, carefully supporting its weight. It feels surprisingly solid, yet still carries a certain fragility. The plaster, while hardened, will continue to cure for days, even weeks, gaining maximum strength over time. For now, it's a delicate new arrival, ready for the next stage of its journey. You've brought a piece of history, a work of art, back to life, in a sense, making it accessible, touchable, and ready to inspire new generations. And as you place it carefully onto a padded surface, you can almost hear the quiet applause of centuries of sculptors and casters, acknowledging a job well done. You stand there, a little bleary-eyed, perhaps a bit like a proud parent who's just witnessed a particularly messy but ultimately successful birth. The newly unveiled plaster cast, still damp in places, gleams with a pristine, almost blinding whiteness. It's fresh, it's whole, it's undeniably there. But if you're imagining it's ready for its museum pedestal right now, well, let's just say you're a few hundred hours of painstaking labor short of that dream. This is where the real artistry, the quiet, meticulous magic, truly begins. This is where you transform a mere copy into a convincing echo of the original. First, you confront the seams. Remember all those strategic cuts and keys you so carefully planned for your multi-part mold? Well, they've left their indelible mark. Like the faint lines on a plastic toy fresh from its injection mold, or perhaps more poetically, like the delicate scars left by a surgeon's precise hand, these raised ridges of plaster snake across your replica. They tell the story of its birth, but it's a story you now need to erase. Your tools for this delicate surgery are a selection of sharp implements, fine-bladed scalpels, small dental picks, miniature chisels, and an array of sanding sticks and sponges with grits ranging from coarse to impossibly fine. You approach the cast, perhaps with a magnifying visor perched on your nose, peering intently at a seam line that runs, say, along the arm of your newly cast Venus. With the utmost care, you begin to scrape. It's not a forceful gouge, but a series of feather-light strokes, coaxing the excess plaster away. You feel the grit of the plaster under the blade, a whisper of resistance, then a soft crumble. The goal isn't just to remove the seam, but to blend it seamlessly into the surrounding surface, making it vanish as if it were never there. Think of it like trying to remove a wrinkle from a silk sheet without disturbing the fabric itself. One wrong move, one slip of the hand, and you could gouge the surface, leaving a new, even more unsightly imperfection. It's enough to make you hold your breath, isn't it? Almost as if the plaster itself is breathing with you, waiting for your next precise movement. As you meticulously scrape and smooth, you'll inevitably discover other little imperfections. Perhaps a tiny air bubble, trapped during the pour, has left a pinprick hole on the surface. Or a microscopic chip occurred during demolding. These are the plaster cast equivalent of a bad hair day, and you, the master craftsman, are here to fix them. For these minor repairs, you'll mix a tiny, almost impossibly small batch of fresh plaster. Just a few drops of water, a pinch of plaster powder, mixed into a creamy, smooth paste. With a fine artist's brush, a dental pick, or even the tip of your finger, you carefully dab this fresh plaster into the void. Then, once it sets just enough to be firm but still workable, you'll blend it, feather it, and sand it until it becomes one with the surrounding surface. It's an iterative process, a dance of application, waiting, and refinement. Sometimes you might even think, is this what it feels like to be a plaster surgeon? My degree in fine arts didn't prepare me for this level of medical precision. Once the surface is as smooth and flawless as a baby's cheek, or perhaps, as smooth as the original sculpture's surface, you move into the realm of patination. This is where the science of chemistry meets the soul of an artist. Patination is the process of artificially aging and coloring the pure white plaster to mimic the appearance of the original material, be it weathered bronze, ancient marble, terracotta, or even aged wood. It's not about painting the cast to look exactly like the original's current state, but rather about capturing its essence, its history, its material truth. You see, the pristine white of raw plaster is a dead giveaway. Few ancient sculptures are still pure white. Time, environment, and human touch have all conspired to give them their unique, often beautiful, patinas. And here's a mainstream historical fact that might surprise you. Many ancient Greek and Roman marble sculptures, which we commonly associate with their stark white appearance, were originally painted in vibrant, even garish, colors. Imagine the Parthenon frieze, not as serene white marble, but as a riot of blues, reds, and golds. Patination, in a sense, is an echo of this ancient tradition of adding color, though often with the goal of simulating age rather than original vibrancy. So, how do you make new plaster look like 1,000-year-old bronze? You begin by preparing your palette. This isn't just about grabbing a tube of brown paint. You're working with pigments, washes, glazes, waxes, and sometimes even a few secret ingredients that sound more at home in a witch's cauldron than an art studio. For a bronze patina, you might start with a base wash of dark umber or black, thin to an almost transparent consistency. This is applied over the entire surface, seeping into every crevice, creating depth and shadow. You might wipe it back in places, leaving the raised areas lighter, mimicking the wear of time. Then come the layers of color. For a classic verdigris, that beautiful blue-green oxidation that forms on aged bronze, you'll meticulously apply thin washes of various greens and blues. You might use a stippling brush, a sponge, or even a fine mist sprayer. The trick is layering, building up the color slowly, allowing each translucent wash to dry before applying the next. You're not painting on the surface, you're painting into it, allowing the plaster to absorb the pigment. You might even dab on some actual copper or bronze metallic powders, buffing them into the surface to catch the light, giving it that subtle metallic sheen. It's a bit like being a culinary artist, adding spices one by one, tasting and adjusting, until the flavor profile is just right. Except here, you're tasting with your eyes, and the only thing you're adjusting is the visual history of a masterpiece. If you're replicating a marble sculpture, the approach is entirely different. You're not aiming for bright colors, but for the subtle discoloration and gentle sheen that centuries impart. Think of the creamy yellowing, the faint gray streaks from mineral deposits, the almost imperceptible pinks from iron impurities. You'll use extremely diluted washes of ochre, raw umber, and subtle grays, applied with soft brushes, often wiped back immediately with a clean cloth. The goal is to create an illusion of depth within the plaster itself, as if the color isn't just on the surface, but in it. You might even use a damp sponge to gently rub away some areas, mimicking the subtle erosion of time. And for a quirky tidbit, some historical restorers, in their quest for authenticity, would even use actual coffee grounds or tea stains, or even carefully selected dirt from the region of the original sculpture, to create a truly aged look, believing that the authentic grime added to the verisimilitude. Imagine explaining that to your significant other. "Honey, why is there a pile of dirt next to the living room's new Greek bust?" The final stages of patination often involve waxes or clear lacquers. These not only protect the surface and the delicate layers of pigment, but they also impart a desired sheen. A matte wax can give the look of unpolished stone, while a buffed carnauba wax can mimic the subtle luster of polished marble or worn bronze. It's all about creating visual texture and depth, making the cast feel substantial and ancient, rather than just a dusty white copy. This entire process, from seam removal to the final buffing of the wax, is incredibly time-consuming. You might spend days, even weeks, on a single cast, returning to it again and again, letting layers dry, observing it in different lights, making tiny adjustments. It's a dialogue between you and the sculpture, a conversation across centuries. You're trying to understand how light would have fallen on the original, how dust settled in its crevices, how human hands smoothed its surfaces over time. It's a meditative practice, almost hypnotic. You find yourself lost in the minute details, the subtle shifts in color, the way a highlight catches the light just so. You might even find yourself humming softly, caught in the rhythm of your own meticulous movements. And after all that, you might look at your hands, covered in various pigments and plaster dust, and think, "Well, at least I didn't accidentally turn myself blue this time." The ethical considerations of patination are also a complex topic. Historians still argue whether patinating a cast to match the current state of an original, which itself might have been altered by centuries of pollution, previous restorations, or even deliberate damage, is truly honoring the artist's original intent. Should the cast reflect the sculpture as it was made, or as it appears now? It's a delicate balance between historical accuracy and aesthetic appeal, and often, the answer lies in the specific purpose of the cast itself. Is it for academic study, a museum display, or a personal collection? Ultimately, your goal is to create a replica that not only accurately reproduces the form of the original but also its spirit, its sense of age, and its material integrity. When you finally step back, your work complete, the plaster cast should no longer scream, "Newly made." Instead, it should whisper, "Ancient," inviting the viewer to believe, if only for a moment, that they are in the presence of the original masterpiece itself. And now you stand there, perhaps a little bleary-eyed from all that meticulous work, gazing upon your newly unveiled plaster cast. The cool, smooth surface of the gypsum gleams faintly under the ambient light, a perfect, ghostly echo of the original masterpiece. You've journeyed through the intricate dance of mold-making and casting, a process that, for centuries, remained largely unchanged, a secret handshake between artisans and history. But what is this object you hold? Is it merely a copy? A pale imitation? Or is it, as the old masters knew, something far more profound? Indeed, your completed plaster cast stands as a testament, not just to your own patience and skill, but to something much grander, historical preservation and enduring artistic beauty. It's more than just a lump of calcium sulfate dihydrate. It's a time capsule, a teaching tool, and a silent ambassador of art. You see, the very first purpose of these casts, even before they became museum staples, was quite practical. They were a way to protect the original. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer, nail-biting terror of a curator watching hundreds of aspiring artists, with their charcoal sticks and eager, clumsy fingers, sketching and tracing directly onto a priceless marble statue. One slip, one accidental nudge, and centuries of heritage could be irrevocably marred. Plaster casts offered a brilliant solution, a durable, replaceable stand-in that could bear the brunt of countless curious hands and still, miraculously, look pristine. It's like sending your stunt double to the dangerous parts of the movie set while the star sips a latte in their trailer. This protective aspect is perhaps the most straightforward, yet it underpins the entire legacy. Beyond simple wear and tear, these casts offered a crucial safeguard against the unthinkable. Consider the devastating impact of war, natural disaster, or even just the slow, relentless erosion of time. A mainstream historical fact that highlights this perfectly is the role plaster casts played during World War II. When bombs rained down on European cities, many museums carefully packed away their precious originals into underground bunkers. But what about the public? How could art education continue? The casts, often too cumbersome or numerous to move, sometimes remained, and in some cases, were even deliberately left out as a form of cultural continuity, or as a last resort. If the original was destroyed, the cast served as the only remaining faithful record. In other instances, casts were evacuated, becoming the only tangible link to masterpieces that might otherwise have been lost forever. It's a sobering thought, but one that underscores the profound value of these seemingly humble reproductions. They were, and still are, art's silent guardians. But the legacy extends far beyond mere protection. Your cast, now cool and solid in your hands, also embodies a powerful form of accessibility. Not everyone can jet off to Paris to admire the winged victory of Samothrace, or to Rome to see the Laocoon group. For centuries, these masterpieces were locked away, geographically speaking, from the vast majority of the world. Plaster casts democratized art. They became the original museum without walls, allowing students, artists, and the general public to encounter the forms and contours of classical antiquity, Renaissance grandeur, or Baroque drama, often for the very first time. You could visit a local art academy in, say, 19th century London, and find yourself surrounded by a pantheon of Greek gods and Roman emperors, all rendered in crisp white plaster. It was like a greatest hits album of global sculpture, long before streaming services made everything available at your fingertips. Though, let's be honest, trying to download a full-size Apollo Belvedere onto your dial-up internet would have been a nightmare. This brings us to the enduring artistic beauty and educational power of the cast. For generations of artists, the plaster cast was their first, and often most intimate, teacher. You, as a budding sculptor or painter in the 18th or 19th century, would spend countless hours in a cast room, meticulously drawing and modeling from these white forms. They offered a perfect, unchanging model of human anatomy, drapery, and composition. The subtle play of light and shadow across their monochromatic surfaces forced you to understand form in its purest sense, stripped bare of distracting color or texture. It was the ultimate artistic boot camp, training your eye to see volume and contour with unparalleled precision. Some might even argue that the very act of drawing from a cast taught a unique discipline, a focused observation that's harder to achieve when confronting the overwhelming complexity of a living model or a polychrome original. And here's where a fascinating, slightly quirky tidbit comes in. Beyond their use in art academies, plaster casts found their way into surprisingly diverse fields. For instance, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, casts were sometimes used in forensic science. Imagine a detective creating a plaster cast of a footprint left at a crime scene, or even a cast of a wound to better understand the weapon used. The ability to capture precise, three-dimensional detail made them invaluable tools for documenting evidence. Or, even more niche, there was a period when casts of famous people's hands, holding pens, or resting elegantly, became popular mementos, almost like a 3D autograph. It's a testament to the versatility of the material and the technique that it could serve both the highest echelons of art and the most practical, earthly pursuits. It's a bit like finding out your favorite opera singer also moonlights as a competitive hot dog eater, unexpected versatility. However, the proliferation of plaster casts also sparked an interesting debate that continues to echo in art history circles today. Historians still argue whether the plaster cast truly conveys the original's aura, or if it creates a unique artistic experience of its own. Some argue that without the original material, marble, bronze, the artist's hand, the patina of age, and the very context of its creation, the cast is merely a cold, lifeless reproduction, devoid of the spark that makes art profound. Others contend that the cast, by stripping away color and material distractions, allows for a purer appreciation of form and composition, offering a different, yet equally valid, aesthetic experience. They might even suggest that the very uniformity of plaster, its stark whiteness, allows for a comparative study across different periods and cultures that would be impossible with the disparate materials of the originals. It's a bit like debating whether a black and white photograph of a vibrant landscape loses something or gains a new kind of stark beauty. There's no easy answer, and perhaps that's the beauty of the debate itself. Your cast, therefore, is not just a triumph of your technical skill, it is a profound link in a chain of artistic transmission that stretches back millennia. It's a silent teacher, patiently waiting for light to fall upon its contours, revealing the genius of its creator. It's a guardian, standing sentinel against the ravages of time and human folly. It's a democratizer, bringing the inaccessible within reach. And in its very whiteness, its lack of original color or material, it invites you to project your own understanding, to imagine the original, to feel the weight of history in your hands. It is, in its quiet way, a masterpiece in its own right, a testament to human ingenuity, a beacon of preservation, and an enduring symbol of how art, even in reproduction, can continue to inspire and educate across generations. You've not just made a copy, you've contributed to a legacy. You've helped ensure that the whispers of ancient sculptors can still be heard, loud and clear, in the modern world. And that, my friend, is a truly remarkable achievement. Now, as the quiet of the night deepens around you, and the last echoes of our artistic journey begin to soften, allow your mind to drift. The cool, smooth surface of that plaster cast, now a familiar friend, seems to hum ever so faintly with the stories it holds. Each curve, each delicate detail, is a whisper from the past, carried gently into your present moment. Feel the weight of it, not just the physical weight in your imaginary hands, but the quiet, comforting weight of history, carefully preserved, lovingly recreated. Let your gaze soften, allowing the sharp edges of thought to blur. The precise measurements, the careful mixing, the patient waiting, all of it now fades into a gentle, rhythmic hum, like the slow, steady breath of the world. Imagine the quiet studios of long-ago artisans, their hands moving with the same deliberate care as yours, under the soft glow of a single lamp, each touch a testament to their dedication. You are part of that lineage now, a quiet participant in a timeless craft. The world outside is settling, too. Shadows lengthen and deepen, embracing everything in their soft, dark embrace. There's no need to rush, no need to grasp at any more details. Just allow the day's learning to settle, like fine dust, into the quiet corners of your mind. Let the imagery of smooth plaster, of ancient forms, of artistic legacy, dissolve gently into the serene stillness that surrounds you. Your mind is calm, your body relaxed, and your spirit at peace. Drift now, with the quiet confidence of knowing you've journeyed through something truly beautiful, something enduring. The work is done. The stories have been told. And now, only quiet remains.